It's important to remind people that the default state of any organism is health, and yet today, so many of us seem to be unwell. I mean, we live in a time where our lifespans are expanding, but we're not actually living longer given current population health statistics. We're dying longer. We're spending more time sick, and I think it's a real shame. About 80% of chronic non-communicable disease is attributable to lifestyle. I'm a huge nutrition nerd, but it's just like, it's one part of the puzzle.
What would you say if you had to pick like maybe 3 other of the most low-hanging fruit? What would make the most difference in terms of longevity and vitality?
People tend to want the easy way out. And I get it, like we live in stressful times, but also you're always one meal from getting back on track. You're always one workout away from getting right back on track. You have to think about this journey as a marathon. It's not a race. Now, I feel very clear in my purpose. I remember distinctly a time when I didn't feel so clear in that.
What's the leading edge of growth for you in your personal life right now?
Oh, man.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Know Thyself podcast. Today we have the privilege and opportunity to sit down with a podcaster, a filmmaker, a New York Times best-selling author, and a health and science journalist, somebody that is going to help us live a more genius life, thrive mentally, physically, and spiritually. You know, all on all terrains.
I love it. I love
Max
it.
Lugavere, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. What an honor.
Yeah, I'm excited to drop in. I want to lay some groundwork before we dive into so much. I love having conversations around what it means to thrive physically, on a physiological and psychological level. And before we do, just feeling into the conversation that we're about to have, what is the promise of the insight and understanding from the work that you've been doing over the past decade, when applied to your life and listening to it as a listener for this podcast and this conversation? What is the promise, I guess, for what this conversation can deliver in the value of people's lives?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. I mean, I think what I hope to offer your listeners is a vision for what life might be like were you to feel your best every day and to live a health span that is concordant with our lifespans today. Today, I mean, we live in a time where our lifespans are expanding thanks to modern medicine, but I want people to kind of shift the way that they think about that, you know, because in a sense, we're not actually living longer given current population health statistics. We're dying longer. We're spending more time sick. And I experienced this firsthand, up close and personal with my mother, who had not just a shortened lifespan, actually, but a vastly diminished health span as well. She was very sick for the last 10 years of her life. And that is really what has motivated my life's work. And all the information that I'm about to share is from a place of genuine curiosity about why it is so many of us seem to be getting sick today. And I don't have all the answers. I never set out to be a health guru, a biohacker, or anything like that. I was really just a concerned son who loved his mom and was really taken aback by what I was seeing develop in her. And so it's my life's mission and purpose, I think, to help prevent suffering for people. And I hope to offer some of the insights that I've gleaned along the way to your audience today.
So let's dive into those 2 areas that you just opened up first, a little bit more differentiating between lifespan and health span, because we all want to live long, but want to live healthy and like vibrant for a long time. And then let's dive into your story and how this passion sparked for you initially with what happened with your mother.
Yeah, so lifespan is obviously the amount of life, the number of years in your life, whereas health span, I think, differentiates from that in the sense that it's the amount of life in your years. A lot of us are spending our final decade or decades of life decrepit, frail, weak, sick, isolated, lonely, depressed, disabled, and I think it's a real shame. You know, I think it's important to remind people that the default state of any organism is health, and yet today, so many of us seem to be unwell. I mean, across the age spectrum, really. I mean, you just look at population statistics. 1 in 2 of us have high blood pressure. By the year 2030, 1 in 2 of us are going to be not just overweight, but obese. You know, many of us struggle with issues related to glucose tolerance, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, things like that. And so it's a big problem. And my particular interest began in this topic began with my mom, who developed a rare form of dementia at the age of 58. She was first diagnosed with a neurodegenerative condition. And my mom was very youthful at the time, still had all the pigment in her hair. She was not the picture of what you might envision when thinking of somebody with dementia, right? I think a lot of people today have experience with Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia. Maybe a grandparent has it. I think it's become fairly common. But my mom was still in the prime of her life and developed this monstrosity of this monstrous set of symptoms. And I had spent the beginning of my career as a journalist. So I was a generalist journalist working for Al Gore post-college. He had a TV network in the US. I don't know if you remember it. It was called Current TV. And so I was there very much like a stem cell, undifferentiated, but covering really important topics and reaching an audience of 100 million people in the United States. And I got to work with some of the best storytellers in the field as an investigator of sorts on a myriad of different like lifestyle-related topics and some more serious, of course. But when my mom became sick, I became unable to focus on anything other than trying to understand to the best of my ability why this happened to her. And I wasn't a medical doctor, though I began college as a pre-med student. I'd always been interested in health and medicine. And I wasn't an academic. I, don't have a PhD in nutrition or anything like that. But I had tools at my disposal that most civilians didn't have at the time. I had media credentials. I had access because of my calling card as an on-camera journalist, having worked for Al Gore for all those years, to reach out to scientists around the world. And because of my interest in fitness and nutrition, I kind of, and of course, as a journalist, I knew where to look for evidence-based, credible information, because it's something that I was doing sort of on the sidelines in my personal life. And without any career aspiration to commercialize like what it is that I was doing, I just wanted to find answers for her. Was there anything I could do to help her from the standpoint of diet and lifestyle? Was there anything I could do at that point to reduce the risk of myself, of me developing that condition? Because I realized that I had a risk factor now at that point, having a family member with the condition. And I experienced in every clinician's office with my mom what I've come to call diagnose and adios. So, I mean, essentially like a physician would run a battery of esoteric tests on my mom, scribble a few notes down on a prescription pad, and send us on our way. So, I mean, to me, that was like Western medicine in a nutshell. And it's not that I had that experience once and in one institution. I had that many times. My family had enough resources to allow us to visit cathedrals to academic medicine around the country. And in every instance, I experienced that very same thing, a 15-minute doctor visit. And it left me wanting more. And so the more I would experience that with my mom, the more rigorously I would approach my research. And ultimately, I decided to begin evangelizing this topic at a time when nobody else was, really. I mean, I think today we kind of take for granted that people talk about the relationship between diet and brain health, and maybe even diet and mental health. But about 10 years ago when I first started this journey, nobody was talking about it. And actually I say this with like utter humility, but I do think that I helped to kind of like usher in this topic as something that people are talking about. I got to go on, huge national TV shows like the Dr. Oz show back in the day, the Rachel Ray show, mainstream news media, really talking about the burgeoning science of dementia prevention. And in fact, I even got to co-author a clinical review, like an academic review on the topic that was published by Springer in 2019. So on top of my books and my podcast and, now my upcoming documentary, it's become my life's work to kind of, I think, evangelize this topic and make it really clear and easy for people and help separate fact from fiction. Because I didn't come to this topic having had a litany of, preconceived notions and biases put into place. Like, my only real bias was that I wanted to help my mom. And so for me as an outsider, really, I think it's really important to part of what I think my duty is to help people better be able to delineate between fact and fiction, because we live in a time where there's just so much information, and not all of it is credible. Not all of it, even if it's credible, is accurate. And so, yeah, that's what I kind of think my mission here is, And again, I don't know everything, but I try to do my best.
I think so many of us, whether it's us personally at times or loved ones, have come across in this Western medical system what is really more of a sick care system, not as much of a healthcare system. And so, I think so many of us have faced the disappointment of what that can really bring in terms of chronic illness, right? For acute injury, it's an incredible system, But to kind of set the foundation, this might sound like a rhetorical question to some, but I think it actually points at something really important. How much of the chronic illness that we see widespread today at large is from us not living in alignment with how we biologically evolved to live?
Yeah, it's a great question. The estimates that I've seen, and these are just estimates, but that about 80% today of chronic non-communicable disease is attributable to lifestyle, which includes diet. So I think what's really important for people to understand is that the vast majority of conditions that society seems to be that seem to be bankrupting society in so many ways today are not determined by one's genes. They're environmentally mediated. Genes don't determine outcomes. And this is particularly true for conditions like Alzheimer's disease, which and other forms of dementia, which the bulk of the research that I've seen is on Alzheimer's disease because it's the most common form of dementia. But it's a condition that's largely influenced by what's called epigenetics. So the relationship between our genes and the environment that we essentially expose our genes to. And so I think that's really empowering. I think it's it gives me great optimism to know that so many of these kinds of conditions, which so many are struggling with, are actually responsive to steps that we might take to right the ship, so to speak.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of preventative medicine and really simplifies things, because I think in the health and nutrition space, it can get very convoluted. It can get very muddied, like so many different opinions. You can find research to support whatever you want to believe, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But when we just bring it back to what we talked about, how 80, +% or like the lifestyle, how it contributes to the development of well-being or chronic illness down the line is really empowering, because it's like the food that we're eating, how we're living in modern society, the bedtimes, the blue light, like all of these things that build up to like a more lethargic system. So I'm excited to dive into coming back into living in modern times, but kind of more how we ancestrally evolved to live. I'm just curious if you want to share a little bit more about that period where you applied your the scientific method and delineating between fact and fiction when it comes to nutrition advice, as you were seeing your mom's health decline towards the later years of her life, and how that indignation and frustration really drove you to the path that you're on now. How is the frustration of learning this and also seeing the tough reality with your mom?
Yeah, I mean, the nutrition thing is really interesting because I'm a huge nutrition nerd. I love the field of nutrition. I think nutrition is endlessly fascinating, but it's just it's one part of the puzzle. And we're still ascertaining what proportion of the pie nutrition makes up, to be honest. I mean, stress plays a huge role. Our, tendency towards exercise or sedentary behavior plays a huge role. Environmental exposures, right? Environmental toxicants play a role. And so I think people that know me at this point, a lot of what I talk about is nutrition, but it's just one part of the pie. It's an endlessly fascinating part of the pie. And as you alluded to, it happens to be a very polarizing part of the pie as well. Because we all eat, everybody tends to feel like they're an expert in their own diets. And I think that there actually is a bit of truth to that. I think the ultimate experiment is the N of one experiment, that somebody listening to this applies to their own life. And so, back, I think when I was going through this with my mom, that's why I first looked at nutrition. It's just a very seductive topic. We all eat. My mom harbored some views about nutrition that I think were fairly common among her generation, that I think she and others like her gleaned from mainstream media. And the fact that her generation, and specifically my mom actually, there weren't many voices necessarily that she had access to counter. Like my mom wasn't on the internet. She didn't know how to use computers or anything like that. She didn't have a smartphone. So my mom wasn't on the internet. So the idea of like doing her own research was not feasible for her. And she came about at a time when, what her generation believed to be true about the internet was or about nutrition rather, was what she heard on the nightly news, and the food industry, like claims on packaged foods and things like that. And today I think we live in a different time, a time where we're much more empowered. I mean, we have all of the world's knowledge at our fingertips 24 hours a day on our smartphones. And I think that it can be a double-edged sword, but ultimately it's empowering because, we have access to all of these different viewpoints. And I think what's great about that is that it speaks to, yes, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but ultimately there are many different dietary patterns that can work for somebody. I think the one salient commonality between all of the dietary patterns that seem to work across the world when you look at long-lived populations is that they typically are low in ultra-processed foods, added sugars, and things like that. My mom's generation, though, grew up gorging essentially on ultra-processed foods because those were the foods that were most likely to make health claims. So growing up, I had, if there was a food in the supermarket that had a red Heart Healthy logo on it, chances are it was going to be, in my kitchen at some point. And so, yeah, we grew up eating a lot of grain products, margarines, like vegetable oil-based alternatives to natural fats and the like. And so I think I started there, with this sort of notion that modern foods and our modern lifestyles beget modern problems, modern chronic disease. And so I took a sort of evolutionary approach to my research, and lo and behold, you see that foods like ultra-processed foods that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen if you tried, are associated with these chronic conditions. And the research is now coming out almost at a breakneck pace. Every week there seems to be a new study linking ultra-processed food consumption with some kind of poor health outcome. This research wasn't even, I don't even think people were talking about ultra-processed foods at the time at which I began my research journey. But now we see that, for example, every 10% increment in ultra-processed food consumption, we see a 25% increased risk of the development of dementia. We see a 14% increased risk of early death, all-cause mortality, death by any cause. So yeah, for me, that's really clearing my mom's kitchen as best I could of these kinds of high-margin, ultra-processed food-like products. That became, I guess, like mission critical for me. And in tandem with that, getting my mom on an exercise program and reducing stress in her life as much as I possibly could. But I tried my best not to be a zealot about the ideas that I was mulling over. And I'll never know what dietary pattern, but even if my mom's diet at all contributed to what she had developed. But yeah, sort of evangelizing the potential dangers of the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods has become, I think, my latest I guess, sort of high-level take-home for people, that these are foods best kept to a minimal proportion of one's diet.
Mm-hmm. One of the most hilarious things that I've seen you post a lot of great health things, but one was the Tufts chart.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just, it's so comical when you see these clearly industry-funded studies where it put like what Lucky Charms and Frosted Mini Wheats above like vegetables in terms of their like nutrition capacity or something.
Yeah, nutrition science is, it's interesting because as much as I love it, like I do have to concede that it's a soft science essentially, meaning, the data that we have is extremely weak and it's muddled by the food industry, whether we like to admit it or not. And the Tufts Food Compass was the latest and I guess most obvious example of where, of the degree to which the food industry and nutrition science make just incredibly strange bedfellows, because you end up with this chart that like makes zero sense. Even a 4-year-old would look at that. And just to be clear, this controversy was the Tufts University, the Friedman School of Nutrition there, created this nutrient profiling system, which they called the Food Compass. And it was in the supplementary material to the paper. They use this algorithm to basically give food scores to items available in your average supermarket. So tens of thousands of food items were ranked, given a score. And a separate group led by Ty Beal, who's a nutrition researcher who I've become friendly with, went into the data and noticed some really odd scores given to foods that, when taken out of their respective food categories and stacked one on top of one another, led to really odd juxtapositions. So, like as you mentioned, like the Lucky Charms and Frosted Mini Wheats and just all these ultra processed foods were given higher scores for whatever reason than their natural food counterparts. Fake egg fried in vegetable oil was ranked higher than an actual egg, and critics to that chart, and they've criticized people like me for calling it out. Have said, well, the scores were never designed. The foods in question were never meant to be taken out of their respective categories and stacked one on top of one another. But that's a ridiculous criticism, because scores are meant to be able to compare things, right? That's what a score is, right? Like we give scores to sports teams to rank them, right? And lo and behold, if you actually went to the Tufts University website, they did the exact same thing. They took a bunch of foods out of their respective food categories and stacked them, and foods with higher scores were meant to be eaten more frequently than foods with lower scores. So the criticisms I thought were bunk, weak, completely unfounded and baseless, and it was just a perfect example of where nutrition science so often gets it wrong.
So can you, it is wild to see in the many examples that are analogous to that. Can you define what ultra processed foods actually are? Because I think we most, can understand it. But then also like the hyperpalatability and the fact that right now, I last believe I saw was 60% of adults and 70% of children, that is their diet makeup of ultra processed foods, which is crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah. Ultra processed foods the term was originally devised in Latin America, and it came to the forefront with the NOVA nutrient profiling system. So NOVA it's a food profiling system comparable in terms of its intention to the Food Compass. But what NOVA did was it just basically ranked foods in accordance with their degree of processing. And it was level 4, I believe. That was the foods with the highest degree of processing were referred to as ultra processed foods, and those are the foods to be minimized. And these are foods that essentially have ingredients that you wouldn't find in your typical kitchen. You couldn't make in a typical kitchen if you tried. They're essentially foods that are only able to be created in the context of industrial food production. And, a lot of obviously snack foods fall under that label. I believe refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils would fall under that bucket, although that's contentious. People debate whether or not where within the NOVA ranking RBD seed oils would fall. But most cakes, cookies, crackers, commercial cereals, things like that tend to be ultra processed. And the reason, there are a number of reasons why ultra processed foods tend to be so nefarious. I think one of them is that they tend to be highly calorie dense. So just the amount of calories that you get in an ultra processed food, it's a lot. They're able to squeeze a lot more calories into ultra processed foods because of the combination of, refined grains often, or other refined starches with added sugars typically, refined fats like oils and things like that. So they tend to be highly calorie dense. They also tend to be, so that's one, they also tend to be nutrient poor. So they use a lot of ingredients that tend not to have a lot of actual nutrition. They tend to be very energy dense, as I mentioned, but they tend to not contain very many essential nutrients. They tend to be low in protein. Protein is the most expensive macronutrient to produce, so they tend to be some combination of carbohydrates and fat. And then the third thing about them that makes them so dangerous is that they tend to have this characteristic referred to as hyperpalatability. So they're not just palatable the way whole natural food is, they are hyperpalatable. So they're more tasty than any natural food could possibly be. And what that does is it sends your brain to a bliss point beyond which self-control is futile. So it's just like you get the 4th of July equivalent of like fireworks in your brain in terms of your dopamine reward centers when you eat these foods. And that's why, that slogan, once you pop, you can't stop, that's like now a truism with scientific backing. There was a NIH-funded study led by Kevin Hall that found that when you give an adult ultra-processed foods to consume, by the time they've eaten those foods to satiety, they've already overconsumed them. So they drive their own consumption. We tend to overconsume them. They're highly calorie dense. And so it's no wonder that, our waistlines are just blowing up, right, around the globe. But especially here in the United States, when you realize that 60% of our calories are coming from these foods that are essentially impossible to moderate. And then I would say the fourth characteristic about them, and this is like, I guess, a newer area of study, but I think worth mentioning, is that they tend to harbor a lot of these environmental toxicants, which we're starting to learn are not beneficial from the standpoint of metabolic health, health span, longevity, hormone health, and the like. And these are the forever environmental pollutants like phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS, which tend to imbue these products. There was a study that just found that pregnant women, who consume largely ultra-processed foods, like they're ingesting a significant amount of phthalates, which are endocrine disruptors.
Yeah, I saw recently too, finding microplastics in utero, which is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, you have to imagine these foods, the network of tubing and the cauldrons that they're stored in, and all the various like mixing and also under high temperatures typically as well, that they're leaching like these chemicals, these industrial chemicals that are xenobiotic. They serve no purpose in the human body and typically do harm. So yeah, I think from those 4 different vantage points alone, and we could probably think of others, the fact that they're so rapidly, we're able to consume them so rapidly. So the speed at which we're able to eat them probably has a downstream metabolic consequence. There's a lot of different problems associated with them. And so to me, it's abundantly clear that these really are beyond the conversation about, which, admittedly has even gotten boring to me at this point, about like carnivore versus vegan, like omnivorous. Like to me, the lowest hanging fruit for anybody at this point in this day and age is going to be to minimize their consumption of ultra processed foods and to base their diet largely around minimally processed whole foods.
Yeah. Great. So then what would you say if you had to pick like maybe 3 other of the most low hanging fruit when you look at sugar, gluten, things that we should and should not be eating, what that would make the most difference in terms of longevity and vitality?
Yeah. I mean, I think sticking mainly to a diet of minimally processed foods, I think that's
king.
That's king. That's king. But then, I think architecting your diet around nutrient density, I think is probably important. Nutrient density, basically what that encapsulates is like the amount of nutrients that you're getting per calorie of food. So a food, for example, and every food has its own sort of like, people do argue about every different food type now on social media, but like dark leafy greens, for example. Like I've gone to bat many times on social media for the value of dark leafy greens, which are a very nutrient dense food. And part of that has to do with the fact that they're so low in calories. And yet when you consume them, you're getting folate, you're getting vitamin C, you're getting dietary fiber, which we know supports a healthy gut microbiome. You're getting phytochemicals like carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin in particular, we know are very supportive to eye health and brain health. In fact, in my first book, Genius Foods, I think I really helped to break the news like on the value of carotenoids from the standpoint of cognitive health. And they're abundant in dark leafy greens, To me, it's no wonder that there was a study published out of Rush University that found that people who eat a bowl of dark leafy greens every day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger. And so that's an observation, right? Correlation doesn't equal causation, but when you actually like look at what is contained in dark leafy greens, you get a lot of good stuff from the standpoint of brain health. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of dark leafy greens. I think other, nutrient dense foods. I'm an omnivore, so I tend to promote the consumption of animal source foods. I'm not a carnivore, so I think like people tend to I think misinterpret my message on social media. And I do kind of lean into it a little bit because it is engagement generating, in the era of social media algorithms. But I think like an ideal diet contains both a mix of whole plant source foods and whole animal source foods as well.
Okay, so minimizing ultra processed foods, upping nutrient dense foods. What are another one or two?
I think hydration is really important. We see that even mild hydration is associated with worse cognitive function. Water these days can be polluted depending on where in the world you are. And so I think drinking clean water is really important. This is a pretty privileged, I guess, statement, but like I love that I get to drink spring water. Like I get spring water now delivered to my house, and I work really hard to be able to afford that. But prior to that, I was reverse osmosis purifying my water. And then before that, I was using a charcoal filter. I think it's really important to make sure that, if you're 72% water or whatever the statistic is, I think it's really important to make sure that the water that you're drinking is clean, And oftentimes, sometimes the sensation of hunger or the sensation of thirst is actually misinterpreted as the sensation of hunger. Because if you think about it, natural whole foods are a fantastic water source. Like whether we're looking at fruits or vegetables or even animal source foods, like you get water from your food. And back before running water and the availability of bottled water, I mean, if water ceased to be available for a hunter-gatherer, they would intuitively know that the next best place to find water was in food. Ultra-processed foods tend to be dehydrated because that improves the shelf stability, the shelf life of an ultra-processed food. And I think that's one of the reasons why they tend to be so minimally satiating. So making sure that you're, drinking adequate fluid, I think that's crucially important as well.
What are your thoughts? Because as a whole, the nutrient density in our food, because of the soil, is much lower. But there's I guess many reasons why someone would choose to go on a plant-based diet, whether it's environmental, ethical, dietary, reasons. Do you believe that if somebody is really prudent and they're understanding what they need, that they can thrive on a plant-based diet? Because I see variance in people's ability to adhere to that long term.
Yeah.
For me, I feel great on it, but also I see other cases where maybe it's not so.
It just takes work. Like dietary adherence is hard. Dietary change is hard for anybody. And so for somebody to adopt that diet, you just have to be, and I know that like some of the more prominent thought leaders in the plant-based movement regularly will sound the alarm, beat the drum about the value of protein and supplementation and things like that. And so I think you absolutely can. I just think that it's going to take more work. And I think for your average person, like not somebody who's fitness and nutrition obsessed, like I am, like, like you seem to be, like others in our space are. I just don't know for sure whether or not those concessions will be made for somebody who's just casually adopting, a diet that eschews such nutrient dense foods as animal source foods. But do I think that it's clear that there are pictures of people. There are examples of people in our space that are thriving seemingly on plant-based diets. And ultimately, like, I think this is something that is maybe maybe people don't fully understand about me. I don't care what it is that people eat. I'm certainly not emotionally invested in what people eat. My passion is really just helping people make informed decisions around their food.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I don't care what anybody eats. Like, I'm focusing on myself and the people in my life that I love and care about, and presenting information so that people can make better and more informed decisions. Because today we live in a time where, there is a lot of what I call covert activism. So people that are making claims about nutrition, but they're doing it from a place of I guess, bias for causes that are not necessarily nutrition centric. Like if I were a physician and I were treating a sick patient, and my advice to them were influenced by anything other than what was going to be the best diet for that sick person to get well. Like if I were considering the environment or animal welfare in my prescription to that patient, that would be highly amoral, obviously. And so for me, I'm just trying to help, like, reduce suffering for people primarily. And that's not to say that I don't care about the environment or animal welfare. I absolutely do. Like I absolutely, I think these are all important conversations that we can have, in tandem with one another.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that I've gained this perspective from seeing like real sickness, like my mom. Like I would do anything to help my mom at that point, when she was still here. And yeah, like to say that at that point, like I was thinking about anything other than what was going to be best for my mom, like that like animal welfare, environmental like concerns, they didn't even cross my mind. I was just, thinking solely about what was going to help my mom at that point. And that's kind of how I approach my prescription or the advice that I give in my books and my work.
What do you think about, because in many ways I feel to know and not to do is to not to know. To know and not to do is not to know.
Yeah.
And a lot of people understand like a lot of the simplistic changes and things that we're diving into conversation today, and understand that processed foods is not good for you. But what do you think about that like knowing and doing gap, where we can like know what's good for us, but we still have the habitual nature to self-sabotage or just to, go for it?
Well, I think it's just people tend to want the easy way out, and granted, we live in stressful times, so I understand that. I understand, especially when my mom was sick and all she wanted was, a pastry from her favorite pastry shop in New York, Viniero's, which is like down in the Lower East Side. Like I went and I remember like in the cold, sleet, snowy, like throes of winter, I would get on a bus or whatever and go downtown and grab those for her, because that would bring her joy in in those moments, especially at a point when her quality of life had become so compromised. And I get it. Like we live in stressful times. There's economic turmoil. There's political unrest. There are 2 wars happening that I know of happening right now in the world. And so I get that people want to self-soothe with food. Food is like it's the most obvious way to do that. But also it really pains me when people do get sick and they show up to their physician's office and they receive that diagnosis and then they walk out scratching their heads wondering, why me? I think we have a lot more agency than we realize. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know why it's a personal accountability thing. We also live in a time where victim mindset seems to be encouraged, or if not encouraged, at least, foisted upon the American public and applauded at times. And there's like this meme that I invoke a lot. I don't know if you've seen it on social media, where it's like 2 lemonade stands, and one stand is offering like the changes that you desire, but they're going to require changing your habits, your diet, your lifestyle, your mindset, right? And the other lemonade stand is offering the quick fix, right? The magic bullet. And you see the line around the corner for the people that want the quick fix, right? So it's kind of like human nature, I think, to a certain degree. Yeah, and it's a problem, You can lead a horse to water, you can't make him drink. You can give somebody all the facts that You feel that they need to make the best decisions for themselves and their loved ones, but you can't make them think. And I think that's just sort of the era that we live in now, unfortunately.
Yeah. I feel like it's also a big part too of just rewiring ourselves to allow us to be compassionate towards ourselves. I think especially when we're stressed and we've had a long work day or things aren't going our way in our career or relationships or whatever, we tend to go to those things that are self-soothing, but also like bring us further down in terms of like accumulating more stress in the body, scrolling on social media, pornography, the ultra-processed foods, the things that give us that dopamine hit in the moment, right? But then also leave us feeling worse afterwards. It's like, I definitely feel like it's just a rewiring process to actually have compassionate practices that don't have a bitter aftertaste.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a fantastic point, actually. And I think like I think in the wellness world can get better at providing real tools for people and not making it seem like you have to be perfect and do everything right and have a 1,500 step morning routine in order to reach a more optimal version of yourself. And I actually try very hard in my work to not perpetuate what I've come to call holistic derangement syndrome, which is a term that I've seen on Twitter that I thought was brilliant. I didn't coin it, but we live in a time now where there is this sort of perfectionist, like everybody has, it's like we're all trying to one up each other with the more optimal morning routine. And I think that's hugely problematic, It's like the more jargon we can stuff into our Instagram captions, for us science communicators and in the health and wellness world, the more credible I think it, people tend to think that it gives our posts, but that's not what people need. People need like the simple daily steps, and I think for most people, just integrating one healthy habit at a time, it's a much easier lift, it's a much easier lift. And then once you've got that going for you, then you could start to do something else. But we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So, if you don't have a hardcore resistance training routine at the moment and you're completely sedentary, well, maybe don't start with like trying to develop the hardcore routine, right? Maybe start by like getting up and going for a few more walks on a day-to-day basis, If your nutrition is total shit right now, maybe just try drinking water in the morning first thing before you drink the coffee with the sugar and the cream in it, And then maybe after you've solidified the morning water as your new healthy habit, maybe reduce the sugar a little bit in the coffee, maybe use like a stevia or something, it's going to have fewer calories or something. Maybe instead of eating dessert 7 nights a week, like so many do, maybe have it on weekends, And when you do choose to eat dessert, make sure it's something that you really love, You're not just eating it passively like a Labrador because that's become habit for you. So yeah, I do think we can be better about lowering the bar, and yeah, I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, I feel like it's not just what we do, but how we feel about what we do, and really enjoying a bite of a dessert versus feeling guilty about it will, I guess build momentum. I feel like, and towards its negative effects on our system, and yeah, just having that process of self-compassion. I do feel like we can get caught in the West, and especially in this scene where it's like so overly focused on the biohacks, and it causes it builds more stress thinking that you have to do all these things to live healthy versus trying to build it into like your harmonious life and make it effortless and just a thing that you're actually excited to do. And then it can build into this like upward spiral momentum where you're feeling good because you're getting morning sun. And so you make healthier choices because you're getting good sleep, and it becomes more of a joy and not like a burdensome thing you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, once you start feeling better, I mean, that becomes its own sort of feedback loop in and of itself.
Yeah.
But you've got to take that first step, And again, like you don't have to be perfect. Like there's no such thing as perfect. I have habits that I know are bad that I wish I could change. I probably spend too much time on social media. I can be too perfectionist in my work. I generally am a good sleeper, but some nights I go to bed later than I'd like. But at the end of the day, for example, with regard to nutrition, you're always one meal from getting back on track. You're always one workout away from getting right back on track. And you have to think about this journey as a marathon. It's not a race, right? Like it's about from a nutrition standpoint, it's about your dietary pattern as a whole. It's not about one meal here or there, or one snack food, or one indulgence. Like, ultimately, one indulgence now and then, or overindulgence, I should say, because indulging is fine, but it's really inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. I mean, your dietary pattern as a whole is what ultimately matters most. As long as you're taking an 80-20, 85-15% approach to things, where 85% of the foods that or 80% of the foods that you're eating are largely whole, minimally processed, then you've got 20% of leeway for the fun foods.
Yep.
And as long as you're not shaming yourself, I think guilt is like all right now and then. I mean, if I go out to a restaurant and I just completely go off the rails and I overeat, yeah, sure, I feel a little bit guilty afterwards because I'm like bloated and I feel like crap, It's okay to feel guilty. Like, we also live in a time where people are like coddled from experiencing normal human emotions that actually serve an adaptive purpose, right? Like, it's okay to feel guilty if you've gone off the rails and you've eaten like an ass. Just don't shame yourself. Like, don't allow that to become negative self-talk and self-loathing and self-hatred. That's not the idea. But I think it's okay to every now and then have like a real conversation with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. So I think it's an endless rabbit hole for like what to eat with nutrition, what not to eat, all these things. But I want to kind of go through some more like needs for our primal ancestral self of how we've evolved in terms of our biology. Another big one, also you touched on one of the chapters in your book, Genius Life, is about timing. So I think to kind of segue into, there's many different aspects of honoring the circadian rhythm, but also timing of when we eat is super important. Our like fasting window. And so in regards to eating times for our last meal, first meal, what do you see as the most powerful reflections there?
Yeah. So this is basically like a field of research now being referred to as circadian biology, and it's a very exciting field. And I'll preface by saying I think it still matters more what you eat than when you eat, but when you eat does have an impact on your health, we're starting to see. A lot of this research is being spearheaded by a researcher named Sachin Panda over at the Salk Institute, who's a great guy. I mean, I'm sure he'd love to come on your show. Brilliant dude who's really elucidating a lot of what we are now starting to understand about the relationship between our bodies and time. And so as diurnal creatures, I think what the research is starting to show is
diurnal means eating during day.
Eating during the day, yeah. I guess as opposed to being a nocturnal creature, it's, like a mouse would eat primarily at night. And so, I think what the research is starting to show is that, if you accept that what you eat is still plays a bigger impact, eating late at night seems to dysregulate our peripheral circadian clocks. So we have clocks in our bodies, if you can picture that. The primary one is in a tiny region of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, within the hypothalamus, which is like the most primordial region of the brain. And it interfaces with proteins in our eyes called melanopsin proteins. And when we are exposed to daylight, it basically sets forth a 24-hour timer. And that dictates when we are to be at our most alert, our most coordinated, our most balanced. It interfaces with our digestion, our enteric nervous system. So, I mean, it's the reason why peristalsis ramps up when we first wake up. Most people will have a bowel movement in the morning. I mean, it's not happenstance that happens. It's just that's when all the processes in our body are sort of ramping up to basically stack the odds in our favor for the day ahead so that we can be at our most energetic, our most focused, seek out new foraging opportunities, find new campgrounds, maybe find a mate for those of us that are unpaired. And so that's why morning light in through the eyes seems to be so important. Now, from the standpoint of food, we have peripheral clocks, and those clocks are primarily in our digestive system because other than the input that we get through our eyes, which alerts our brains as to the time of day that it is, the other major input is like when we're eating. And it seems to be the case that when we eat too late at night, which is not when we're really meant to eat, because once the sun goes down, prior to the advent of artificial light, we would start to secrete a hormone in our brains called melatonin, which would make us typically get sleepy, and we would tend to probably sleep not too long after dusk. Today we have artificial light, and so we're awake at all hours. I mean, the modern world has become the equivalent of like a Vegas casino. But so if you accept that one of our ancestors, for the vast majority of our time on this planet, would have gone to bed soon after sundown, then the fact that we're now eating well into the night, like right up until the moment before we typically go to sleep, that leads to some degree of asynchrony in these peripheral clocks. And so what the research is starting to show is that, eating too late at night can have a negative impact potentially on various cardiometabolic markers like blood pressure, blood glucose. It seems to perpetuate next day hunger, not to a massive degree, but that there's at least one study that I'm thinking of, and I can send you the reference. I forget the journal that it was published in, but it found that for people who ate very late at night, they had an increase in next day hunger. They consumed more calories, and they actually saw a drop in their resting metabolic rate the next day. So they burned fewer calories as well. So for me, what that basically entails, and there are all these other interactions, between, for example, insulin, which is the fed hormone essentially after we eat. Generally, we see a rise in the hormone insulin. There's a relationship between insulin and brain health. There's an enzyme that degrades amyloid beta in the brain, which is a plaque that's associated with Alzheimer, or a protein that's associated with Alzheimer's disease that gets degraded by an enzyme called insulin-degrading enzyme. As the name implies, it also exists to break down insulin. So we're just at the very tip of the iceberg, but it doesn't seem to be in our benefit to eat too late at night. And so the advice that I give generally is very simple: is just stop eating 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep. And I think that's helpful in light of this burgeoning field of study known as circadian biology. If you eat close to bedtime, it's not a big deal, and it also ultimately, I think, for pretty much everybody, is going to depend on what goals are. So, I mean, there are some studies where, they'll give people who are focused on building muscle protein before bed, and they see that it actually increases overnight muscle protein synthesis and reduces muscle protein breakdown. So you have to kind of like take all of these different studies and synthesize them, and just at the end of the day, pick and choose and kind of see like what your goals are.
Right.
So I try not to make any like sweeping recommendations, because if you're on a vigorous resistance training routine, as I am personally currently right now, there might be value to eating protein late at night, or before you go to sleep. But for your average person who's eating 16 hours a day, there does seem to be some value in constraining that feeding window to maybe an hour after you wake up is when you have your first calorie, and then cut it off 2 to 3 hours before going to bed. That also has the benefit of assisting with calorie control. A lot of people do see benefit from intermittent fasting from the standpoint of weight. It's not magic. It's not better than calorie restriction, but it does seem to provide a parameter for people to help them better control their calories. Also, we tend not to eat very healthful things after dinner anyway. Like the foods that most people tend to eat while watching TV after dinner tend to be all ultra-processed snack foods. So for a lot of people, it seems to be it's a really helpful means of just controlling calories and achieving better body composition as well.
So I feel like in my own health journey, I've put sleep as kind of the cornerstone in which so much of what I eat, when I eat, all these things are really informed. Because when I get a good night of sleep, and I do fairly frequently because of how much I prioritize it, like my nightly routine, when I go to bed, getting sunlight in the morning, all these things set up my clocks, I feel like, within to be able to wake up and have the cognitive ability I need for my goals of having these conversations and podcasting. And also getting good sleep, I feel, strengthens willpower, and having a bad night of sleep builds that spiral down for the next day of not having as much will to decide eating the healthy things or whatever. And so I found to prioritize the optimalness of my sleep, and I'd be curious to hear what have been your few key, most important metrics for improving sleep. 95% of the time, my eating window is between 11 and 3. I stop pretty early in the day when eating, but I feel like I get enough calories. I still eat a lot during that window, but I'm not digesting anything by the time I go to bed. And with winding down and having red lights at the house and not, exposing to blue light at night. All these things I feel like really contribute to waking up feeling restful, and life just is so much better perceived. Like you're just so much more joyful. I feel like I have a better outlook and perception on the world simply by getting good sleep, which it depends on like all these things that we're talking about. So what are the other, few key metrics that you feel like in terms of optimizing sleep?
Yeah, I mean, sleep is crucial from the standpoint of mental health, hormonal health, body composition, recovery from exercise, brain health. We know that our brains literally clean themselves during the hours in which we sleep, thanks to the fairly recently discovered glymphatic system. So sleep is crucial. I mean, I tend to, these days from a food standpoint, I generally eat like 4 meals a day, and I try to get about 40 grams of protein with each meal, because I'm in a phase right now. I just really I've been leaning into I'm a closet meathead. So I've been leaning into like the resistance training and trying to like really optimize the muscle protein accrual process of things. But sleep plays a huge role in that. I mean, if you're not recovering, like you just can't train as hard in the gym, and your hunger patterns are all dysregulated, as you alluded to. Your mental health isn't as great. For me, some of the big levers with regard to optimizing sleep, I think it's really important to keep a cool bedroom. Maybe I'm biased, but I tend to sleep hot. So I keep a cool bedroom, and I also have a mattress cooler.
Same.
Yeah. There were many nights where I would just like wake up sweating.
Yeah,
if same. Not every night. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like that can't be normal.
Yeah.
I guess, but if you're sleeping hot and it gets hotter there, it's just going to happen.
There's some like Ayurvedic, I'm definitely not an expert in this world, so I'm going to sound like an idiot to anybody who knows about it, but like, don't you have there's like more fiery body types?
Yeah, like Kapha or Pitta is the fire.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe that's us,
Yeah.
Who knows?
That's some Pitta for sure, both of us.
Yeah. So I try to keep my bedroom as cool as I can, as dark as I can. I see a lot of sleep improvement when I take 3 grams of glycine before bed. I'm a huge fan of glycine, and there are clinical trials to show that 3 grams of glycine before, which is just a free form amino acid. It's not, I think it's synthesized like synthetically. And they've shown that can actually reduce the time that it takes to get to sleep. It helps your body better modulate temperature. And so I love that. I think the evidence on magnesium is actually a little bit weaker than it's often, than people often make it out to be. But, I supplement with magnesium on a daily basis, and I find that helps my sleep as well, subjectively.
Yeah.
Warm shower before bed. These are just the basics. And then getting that morning light in has been shown to actually help with sleep as well.
Anything else you want to share there in terms of like a spike of cortisol, or like why as early as we can upon waking, that light, like it just sets up that clock?
Yeah, well, the light sets up that timer. And so the timer dictates when you're going to be at your most virile throughout the day and alert and awake. But it's a 24-hour timer. So it also influences when you start to feel sleepy in the latter end of the day. It plays a role in melatonin release. So yeah, good sleep actually begins like the morning of. I also think it's really important. Sleep scientists will often refer to the concept of sleep pressure. So making sure that you are not just active throughout the day, but actually, like exercising, like actually stressing your body to the degree that recuperation is needed, right?
Yeah.
If you've spent all day sedentary behind a computer screen, like what does your body need? You're not sending the signal to your body that it even needs recovery, So building sleep pressure with exercise, I think, is really important. And I think there have been a few studies to point out that resistance training seems to be the form of exercise training that builds it up the most. Aerobic exercise is good, but when you're stressing your CNS, your nervous system, with resistance training, heavy, intense resistance training, not just is it incredibly valuable from the standpoint of body composition, but it seems to also help, encourage reduced sleep latency, which is the time that it takes to get to bed, improve sleep quality and the like. So Yeah. I mean, I do all these things, and I'm not saying that I'm like a perfect model for optimal sleep, but like I sleep pretty well.
All right, rad. Any other little tiny sleep hacks? I'm personally a huge fan. Yeah, I mean, blacking out the room is huge. Do you do mouth tape or like eye mask,
I used to
special pillow or
I have
anything? Teddy bear?
Yeah. I use firm pillows. I sleep on my stomach, which I know I shouldn't. Back health experts, or whatever lumbar experts will, probably come after me. But yeah, I don't think it's like I don't have like a magical sleep routine. I do have I have a lamp by my bed, and the light bulb in it is red.
Yeah.
And so that's a very cheap thing that anybody can order from Amazon. And I think that really helps to have like a red light in the bedroom so that you can turn off all the lights and just keep on your red.
Same, yeah.
It makes my bedroom look like a strip club. But
it's more of a vibe.
Yeah, it's a vibe. It's a vibe. And it's good for, it's good for romance, but it's also like great for, as you're winding down. You want to reduce the amount of light that you allow to enter your eyes in that latter portion of the day. Sleep consistency is also very, very valuable.
Going to the bedtimes consistently every night, basically.
Yeah, consistent bedtimes is super important. Because if you think about it, if you go to bed at 10 o'clock at night during the week, right? And then Fridays and Saturday nights, you're going to bed at 1 in the morning. It's like basically you're flying to New York from LA every weekend. And then people wonder why Mondays suck, It's because you're essentially jet lagged. You're starting every single week jet lagged.
So wild. Yeah, it's so true. I feel like I've gotten a little bit of a reputation in my community as kind of a grandpa, like because I feel that if I go to bed at 11 or 12 just because I want to go to a gathering, like the gathering's got to be really freaking good for me to do that, because I know that the cascade of the effect of the next week is just gonna, I'm pretty sensitive in that, and not like I'm resilient to where I can get up and get after it regardless. But like if I'm prioritizing what I'm committed to most, which is like my purpose and what I feel like my dharma is in sharing this podcast and conversations, I just want to be as alive and sharp as I possibly can. And so prioritizing that, but it does, often lead me to leaving gatherings at 8:30 when it's, still rocking.
Dude, you gotta keep your eye on the prize. And for me, like lately I've been, for the past year, I've always been like a fitness junkie, but for the past year, I've been really dialing up the intensity of my workouts. And
I don't think you're a closet meathead anymore, bro. I think
you think it's public?
Full meathead, dude.
Yeah, I think I am. I think I've gone full meathead, but and I'm not saying that everybody, but I genuinely enjoy it because I see the feedback loop. Like it's just so clear. Like once you dial that all in, I'll just give you like a quick example of like where I've changed my thinking on fitness, and and this is what I wouldn't consider myself like a fitness expert, but I lean into and I read a lot of the fitness research, and I follow a lot of like evidence-based fitness experts and coaches and the like. And, you go to the gym and you see a lot of people like lifting a weight that they perceive as heavy, but then they put it down while they still have like 5 or 10 reps in reserve, so to speak, reps in the tank. You don't have to take every rep to failure, but you should be getting pretty close to true failure, for most sets. And once that clicked for me, it's not, when I say that my workouts have gotten more intense, it's not that I'm like gushing sweat, I'm like huffing and puffing. It's just that I lift now every set. I try to calibrate my sets so that I'm lifting a weight heavy enough, and I try to get as close to failure as I can, if not go all the way to failure, and sometimes even go past failure. Because that's the signal that tells your muscles to adapt and grow stronger or die. And so when you're lifting with that degree of intensity, I mean, not only is it taxing on your central nervous system, which you can recover from if only you were to like sleep on have quality sleep on a consistent basis. But, it's like that's what stimulates the most muscle growth as well. And so, I see a lot of people kind of just like phoning it in the gym, and they think that just working their muscles provides the adequate stimulus to grow. You've got to actually like challenge your muscles. And so, yeah, like getting in that quality sleep is like mission critical to recovering, so that you can just do that every day, like to a different muscle group every day. I'm not hitting the same muscle group 2 days in a row, but the point is like, once that feedback loop is in place, like for me, I'm so excited to wake up and like go to the gym and know that I'm firing on all cylinders. like for the given, muscle group that it is that I'm exercising on that day. And you can really only do that with like good quality sleep.
Yeah.
So you got to dedicate yourself to something like, like a goal like that. Like maybe it's getting in your best shape. And then the sacrifices, they just work themselves out.
I definitely feel, and maybe towards the later part of this conversation, we can touch on this a little bit. But having a why and a chief aim that you're moving towards, like if you don't have that, it's tough to build a framework for like building priorities and what really matters to you, because you don't have something you're in the pursuit of. Like if you don't have a reason to want to wake up feeling refreshed and sharp outside of just it feeling good, but like what it's going to contribute to in your relationships and career or whatever, then it's just going to be much harder to follow that, I feel like. So I'm excited to touch on that. Now we're here into this, primal need for movement. What is NEAT? Let's talk about that, because we largely live these sedentary lives right now. And we talked a little bit about resistance training, which we can touch on more, but also all the other hours of the day, what we're doing with our body, how much we're active is really contributing to overall caloric expense and metabolic health and everything.
Yeah, well, NEAT is really important. It's non-exercise physical activity. And NEAT, well, non-exercise physical activity leads to non-exercise physical activity thermogenesis. So the basically the burning of heat, the burning off of calories, with your just everyday subconscious movement. So the fact that I'm like, shaking my foot here, a form of fidgeting, that falls under the bucket of NEAT. So it's like movement that you do that falls outside of the bucket of exercise that actually cumulatively over the course of a day adds up to a massive calorie expenditure. Far more calories burned doing NEAT than you would ever hope to burn on a treadmill or on a stationary bike or Stairmaster. And so just being more active, I think it's really important. And just going on a walk is not necessarily exercise. It's just being mobile and moving about the world. Chasing your kids or your cat around the house, walking your dog. There are so many opportunities for NEAT in over the course of one's day. But today, leisure time physical activity is at an all-time low in general, and we tend to be more sedentary than ever before. And there are benefits to NEAT outside of the calorie burn. NEAT is a great way to reduce triglycerides, which is fat in the blood. It's a great way to reduce blood sugar. Even just going on a brief 5-minute walk after a meal is a great way to reduce, that postprandial, post-meal glucose excursion. And so it tends to be, because of how mundane, these movements and these activities are, they tend to be underappreciated, but yeah, almost as valuable, if not more so than like I wouldn't say more valuable, but definitely, as valuable as a gym routine is just moving about the world more regularly. Sometimes I'll park my car at the far end of the parking lot when I go shopping for food, because it's just a way to integrate more steps into my day. So yeah, it's super important.
Yeah, I feel like also finding the ways in which it can be more of a natural process in our day instead of one of those other boxes we have to tick to try to live up to our ideal healthy self. But like you said, parking further away or taking the stairs instead of the escalator, or like walking when you're taking your calls. Like, are there any other things that you do kind of to naturally implement into your day?
Well, the interesting thing about NEAT is that it's such a massive calorie burn that part of when people are on fat loss diets, part of the metabolic adaptation that occurs when you start to bring your calories down, your calorie intake down with the intent of losing fat, oftentimes people will notice that their fat loss slows at a certain point. And it's not because you've damaged your metabolism, but the body actually subconsciously ramps down NEAT. It ramps down non-exercise physical activity in order to preserve energy, because it senses that your body is in a calorie deficit. And that's, again, just like a testament to how many calories subconsciously, how effortlessly your body will just burn calories. So people that are on fat loss diets for extended periods of time, and I actually experienced this myself about a year ago when I was doing a bit of a cut, you fidget less. you have less energy. Like you notice, well, you don't even necessarily notice it because again, it's subconscious, but if you do kind of tune your mind to it, you'll see that, your body just moves less when you're in a calorie deficit. And conversely, when you're in a calorie surplus, you might actually have more energy. And that energy, your body like needs to get it out, right? So people will fidget more. And so it's just a really interesting like way in which our subconscious mind adapts to our body's energy status. And I guess the take home there is that, there is NEAT is, largely subconscious, but you can kind of reverse engineer it, like by just moving more, to, I guess, counter the effects of metabolic adaptation if you do desire to lose fat, which, I'm sure is a concern to many people. But yeah, I think it's just important to move, anything is better than sitting on the couch for an extended period of time. And I sit on my couch enough to know that, outside of the world of recovery, it's, we do tend to spend too much time being sedentary. Like even somebody who's active today is like minimally active compared to one of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, who's just like running around all the time on a consistent basis, foraging, looking for mating opportunities, new campgrounds, et cetera. I mean, today life has become just so easy. And I think that's, it's the comfort crisis. It's been to the detriment of our health.
Mm. Yeah. And that also builds momentum too, just towards lethargy and conforming to these box lives that we've created for ourselves and sitting in our chairs and all these things. And so I definitely agree and feel the same in regards to NEAT coming down, like the lower the caloric intake is and also what the lifestyle is. Like some people that choose an aesthetic life or like monks who are meditating 10 hours a day, like their average resting heart rate, I'm sure is just so low and their energy expenditure is so low and they need so much less food. And they're literally like, it's a more active form of sleep, the brain states that they're actively in for the most of the day. And so, some days can even go without eating or you don't really need that much.
Yeah.
And that's one end of the spectrum versus somebody who's, working out twice a day.
Well, that's the thing. I remember looking into this research back when I was writing my first book. The brain doesn't like require that much more energy when given a cognitive task. It generally is using the same amount of energy, like in the macro sense, right? Like your brain accounts for 25% of your basal metabolic rate. And so it's a massive energy consumer. So you're not going to see variations in its energy utilization. Like it's not going to come out in terms of like, it's not going to affect your overall daily calorie needs, right? Like your brain its calorie burn isn't that labile. Like it is what it is, it's fairly static. But it's your body that burns calories. And having more muscle in your frame is going to burn more calories compared to having less muscle in your frame. Not by a huge margin. I think sometimes it's overstated how much, additional calories muscle will burn. Your muscles do burn calories just sitting on your frame. And so it's another reason why I think focusing on resistance training is so valuable. We're starting to now hear about the role of skeletal muscle in the context of longevity, of health span. The health of your skeletal muscle is now being considered a vital sign of sorts. My friend Gabrielle Lyon talks all the time about the value of muscle in the context of longevity, and she's coined muscle-centric medicine to describe her approach, which I think is really novel and interesting. So yeah, I mean, it plays all these many important functions in the body, but again, just burning calories, because today most of us live we live amidst energy excess. We're just inundated with exposure to these ultra processed foods. And again, so many of us are overweight. So many of us are glucose intolerant. It's not necessarily that we're just consuming too much sugar or that we're consuming too much fat or animal products or anything like that. It's just we're consuming too much, And I think it's a phenomenon being driven largely by the nature of our food, the food itself, which is ultimately not food. It's food. They're food-like products that we're ingesting. And so yeah, that's where muscle, I think, the more muscle we can have on our frames, the better off we'll be, I think, within a certain healthy range, right?
Yeah. And also like maintaining bone density through age.
Yeah, I mean, lifting weights is like the number one thing that you could do for bone health. Keeping your protein high, obviously, but I remember my mom was suffering from osteopenia, which is like, I guess, the prodrome to osteoporosis, and she was prescribed like these calcium caramels, and my mom was like, okay, well, if I take the calcium caramels, then I'm protected. But I mean, like, where was the talk of where was the prescription for resistance training? Now we're starting to see how valuable resistance training is from the standpoint of, and muscle accrual is from the standpoint of bone health and protein consumption. And, there's certain minerals that can help. I think boron has been shown to play a role, obviously vitamin D. But yeah, I mean, especially as you get older, fighting off frailty is is mission critical to aging well.
Yeah.
And bone health plays a huge role.
I had a friend on, Darren Oline, probably a mutual friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love his last book, Fatal Conveniences, about the toxic world we live in. I think it just runs in tandem with the frustration we feel for the Western medical system with like the prescription of drugs and the perpetuating of a business that keeps essentially sick people are great customers, right? But then also on the flip side, how much toxic chemicals we are exposed to. And so I just want to touch on, what do you see as the most deleterious things that we're exposed to, whether it be air quality, the things that are in our water, furniture around us, VOCs. What do you think are the most important things to bring into our awareness that can protect us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and there's so much to cover, and it's hard to really kind of cover the topic and do it justice without unduly fear mongering, because we do live in a world that has become largely toxic, and we're inundated with exposures to industrial pollutants, even from the point of conception. I mean, it was either the EPA or the Environmental Working Group. The Environmental Working Group, has its own set of detractors because it's funded largely by the organic industry, but found something like 300 industrial pollutants in cord blood that we're exposed to, even as embryos, as fetuses. And, so it's terrifying. And today, our store register receipts, our water, our food is contaminated, has become contaminated with these environmental pollutants. Our air, we're starting now to see a very clear link between air pollutants, fine particulate matter in particular, and the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. That, there are compounds in the air, brake dust, right, that like we can inhale, pierce the blood-brain barrier, right, because whatever we inhale through our noses has very easy access to the brain and can catalyze pathology that looks a lot like accelerated aging and ultimately the signs that we associate with Alzheimer's disease, plaque aggregation and the like. They've done studies in Mexico City where, they receive cadavers from across the age spectrum, right? People who've been killed, various accidents and whatnot. And they've seen that people who are exposed, even children who are exposed to high levels of air pollution, have Alzheimer's-like pathology in their brains. And in fact, it was the 2020 Lancet Commission on Dementia, where air pollution was for the first time actually highlighted as a modifiable risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, which is a condition that takes years to develop, right? I grew up in New York City. My mom, born and bred New Yorker, lived there her whole life. I know the city's cleaned up its air quite a bit over the past couple of decades, but it's a polluted city. There's a lot of noise pollution. There's a lot of air pollution.
Yeah, noise pollution. Most people aren't as familiar with.
Yeah,
this is the fact.
Stimulates your body's fight or flight. Without your consent. I think it's a major problem. It's one of the reasons why I couldn't wait to get out of that city. Mm-hmm. And I still love New York, but yeah. So I mean, air pollution. Our water's become polluted. Our food has become polluted. It's a huge problem. So I think do the best that you can. I tend to buy organic fruits and vegetables where I know that I'm eating the skin or the peel. And if I didn't have access to organic, I wouldn't stress about it. I would just rinse. I mean, you want to rinse organic, as well, but make sure that you're rinsing your produce. Make sure that you're bolstering your body's own defenses, like your own resilience. And I think exercising, eating a healthy diet, regardless of whether it's organic or not, is going to go a long way. Making sure that you're integrating a lot of antioxidants and things like that in your diet through whole foods. You're sweating on a regular basis because sweat is a major route of exit for certain pollutants. Making sure the water that you're drinking is clean. I mean, if I'm traveling and I have to drink water out of a plastic bottle, of course I'll do it. You know, I'm not like trying to drive myself crazy, but you know, it's important to recognize that drinking water in plastic bottles, whether it's microplastics that we're talking about or the leaching of phthalates and other plastic-related compounds into our bottled water, it's a real genuine concern
because of their endocrine disrupting qualities and many other things.
The thing about endocrine disruptors that make them tricky to study, and this is one of the reasons why there's so much debate around them, is that most things, most compounds have a point of toxicity, and this is why we always say the dose makes the poison, right? Pretty much, you can think of any compound you can think of, pretty much, like water even. Like there's a linear dose response after a certain point. Water, whether it's the rate at which you drink it or the quantity, can become toxic, right? I forget the condition, but you can drink enough water rapidly enough where your electrolytes get diluted to a point of serious concern and possibly even risk of death. And this concept applies to most chemicals, most compounds. But the problem with endocrine disruptors is that they often have what's called a non-monotonic dose response. So they can be toxic at a certain level or show effects in the body at a certain level and then go quiet below that level, right? But then have different effects at very low levels. And so this is what makes these chemicals really difficult to study. But our hormones it's a network of chemicals in our body. It's how organs, essentially talk to one another. And you don't want to mess with that system. Like it's involved in everything from, obviously sexual function, body composition, libido, but also brain development, energy homeostasis, hunger levels. Everything in the body is basically dictated ultimately by hormones. And so our exposure, our exposome now includes innumerable endocrine disrupting compounds. And, we don't even have names for probably the vast majority of them, but it's definitely something worth being mindful of without driving yourself crazy.
And it's very easy to drive yourself crazy as you see how much there is in everything.
Yeah, I just try to do the best I can. I
Right.
try not to eat a lot of fast food. We know that, you're exposing yourself with fast food. I try not to touch store register receipts. I try to minimize my exposure to plastic. I try to eat as whole food, as whole food centric a diet as I can, because we know that you get higher levels of these compounds in ultra processed foods. I try to sweat regularly. I try to be as strong as I possibly can in body. I try to stay hydrated because one of the major solutions to pollution is dilution. So just making sure that you're drinking, you're staying hydrated and the water that you're drinking is clean. And that's pretty much it, like it's sort of, it is inevitable that living in the modern world, and the modern world is great. Like I love the modern world, like the modern world, all the trappings of the modern world, I partake in them, right? But there is some degree of exposure that is inevitable. We can't freak out about that. We just have to do our best to stack the odds in our favor, right?
Yeah.
And look, at the same time, you're going to look better naked. You're going to feel better. You're going to have better digestion. You're going to have more mental clarity. You're going to have possibly better mental health, like by taking all these same steps. So I'm not suggesting that anybody go out of their way, but so long as you're eating an antioxidant rich diet, you're sweating on a regular basis, you're basically bolstering your own resilience. And similarly with I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine who is a cancer expert. He's a PhD in cancer. He's a cancer biologist. We're exposed to carcinogens on a daily basis. But just because you're exposed to a carcinogen doesn't mean that you're going to develop cancer, because your body can defend itself. So you just want to make sure that you're doing good by your body. You're stacking the odds in your favor.
Yeah.
And you're keeping that balance I guess, optimized towards resilience and recovery and robustness.
Yeah. And that you're just, I guess, being prophylactic with how you're moving about, like enhancing your detox pathways and, living in modern society, obviously inevitably being exposed to toxic chemicals, but making those moves that I feel setting up your life in a way that is automatically already going to boost, minimizing the toxic buildup and bucket within ourselves. So like you kind of spoke to getting clean water filter and air filter and organic bed sheets and the things that like we just automatically are always breathing the air in our house and drinking the water that we're drinking, and it requires like a decision, but then you don't really have to think about the decision once you've made it, but then you receive the benefits of it there afterwards.
Set it and forget it.
Yeah. So those are like, I feel like the biggest low hanging fruit of like, what are the detergents and cleaners that you're buying and the sheets that you're sleeping in and all those things. And then you can obviously get more nitpicky with the glyphosate that maybe somebody's shoes stepped on a lawn before they walked in your house, or what, all the different little things that...
Yeah, I mean, and again, going back to like the wellness world on social media, there is a lot of like, I don't believe you need to buy everything organic. I mean, if you can't afford to buy anything organic, then that's fine too. I think like you have to meet people where you're at, and I think part of the privilege that I've had to get to go on many national TV shows, for example, and reach huge audiences of people that aren't just following nutrition hashtags on Instagram and whatever, Like I get to reach people in food deserts. I get to reach people like across the socioeconomic spectrum. And you've got to meet people where they're at.
Yeah.
You can't just scare people.
And it's so easy to forget that's the majority of how like America at least is living right now. We live in a bubble of these health conscious podcasters in the west side of LA, which is really great. I love the modern world too. I feel like for me, it's pretty easy to forget how widespread, like how frequent the standard American diet is and these food deserts, and like what the reality of the majority of people living in America are like.
It's pretty bad. Yeah. I mean, it gets pretty bad, but there's hope, I think like I'm very grateful.
Max.
Yeah.
Can't forget there's hope, folks.
There's hope. I mean, look, the fact that the wellness industry is a double-edged sword, and I think there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of marketing. There's a lot of good to come from it, because now you can go to freaking Costco and you can buy frozen wild salmon. You can buy organic at Walmart. I think it's like, I think we've done a lot of good in terms of waking people up to the power that their choices have, were they only to make those choices. And and I think as long as you're following like credible people that seem to be unbiased and seem to be authentic and dedicated to truth, I think you really can't go wrong. And I think like, over the course of one's journey, you're going to try things that don't necessarily work. You're going to maybe spend some money that, I can't tell you how much money I've spent on supplements over the years. Like, and I still do. I still buy supplements knowing that half of them aren't doing anything for me, right? But I enjoy it. I enjoy the process of discovery, and I know that I'm on this like N of one journey, and that even supplement studies that that elucidate an average effect size. Like I could be one of the population where maybe there's a negative effect. Like studies only elucidate averages. So you have to kind of like have a growth mindset and be willing to experiment and embody an open mind and curiosity. And I think that's all part of the fun, as long as you can stay away from the wackos that are trying to tell you that broccoli is killing you and that oatmeal is toxic. And, granted, maybe there is some toxic oatmeal out there, like there was a new study that found that, a lot of non-organic oatmeal in the US is contaminated with chlormequat, which is like some, crazy new chemical that is like a desiccant or something, or a pesticide or an herbicide or something like that, at very low levels, I'll admit. But like, at the end of the day, as long as you're sticking to primarily whole foods, I think like you're doing better than most.
Yeah. I think it goes back to where we started initially with this conversation, for those that just want to give ourselves the best chances to extend our health span, to be able to live life in a vibrant, healthy state, where we can go after the things that are most meaningful to us. Like, I think it can be a little solipsistic when we're so overly focused on just healing our health journey, which we need to at certain points, maybe if we're sick or whatever it is, but then we're meant to live our life, and so we touched on some things to and not to eat, understanding this whole umbrella. You could have a podcast with hundreds of episodes and you still won't even touch 5% of, because there's so much there, right? But we touch on that and timing and movement, and the toxic world that we live in. I want to kind of wrap up the last topic of this podcast talking about some of these less quantitative, I guess, or easily measurable intrinsic qualities that I think are really important to reflect on. One of which being, and I'd love to hear your personal opinion, about crafting a vision of a future that excites us for our life to go after. And like, I'm just curious because so much of these things get motivated, like we spoke to earlier, when we have a vision of a future that excites us, when we feel like we're living in alignment. And I think that we all go through our own journeys of sometimes feeling more lost or more on it with how we're serving on the planet and whatnot. But how has clarifying what life wants to use you for, in a way, been clarifying in your own journey and bringing joy to your life?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very clear in my purpose. And I remember distinctly a time when I didn't feel so clear in that. I guess you refer as your dharma. Is that like?
That's a way to, yeah.
Yeah,
a way to say it.
I love that. Yeah, I think I'm very clear on what my dharma. I've become more clear on what my dharma is, and I love that term. And for me, I had to go through, a fiery pit of trauma and tragedy and sadness to get there, but yeah, for me, it's become very clear. And, right now what I do is at the intersection of, I think, my skills, my passion, my interests, what I feel like the world needs, what I'm able to monetize. And I feel very, very grateful. I mean, even though I did end up where I'm at due to something really awful that happened in my life with my mom, and, and I would give it all back in a second to have my mom back and in good health. I also love what I do, and I wake up every day excited, and because I love what I do, I feel like I'm able to do my best at whatever it is, whatever task I'm given. I don't always get it right. I'm definitely always learning. I'm not perfect, but I think as long as you're doing the best you can on a given day, I think that you're likely going to be on the right path. Trusting in myself was also a really important sentiment to just feeling ultimately that no matter what happened, I had my own back. Really helped propel me through those dark moments where I didn't know what was coming next. There was a time when I didn't know how I was going to pay my bills, when I didn't know how I was going to pay my rent. But just knowing that, feeling a genuine sense that there was something in me that that could serve the greater good, really helped push me forward. And and then just adding value where I could to people, whether on social media, given the tool, whatever tools I had access to at any given time, really helped to cement that sense that I had that I was on the right path, because people were responding to what it was that I was putting out and what it was that I was talking about. So it's a really wonderful feeling, and it's a feeling that I wish for anybody listening to this. I feel super aligned, and I don't know what I'm going to be doing 10 years from now. Hopefully the same thing, but yeah, it's been quite the journey, and honestly, I don't think that I could have said that I'd had it all figured out up until maybe about 5 years ago. And I'm 41 now. So, I mean, it's taken me, the better part of my 30s to really feel this sense of security about what it is that I'm doing. but yeah, just grateful that I've landed here.
Yeah, it's funny the areas that you mentioned I refer to often on the show. I feel like by the Japanese term ikigai, which is just the intersection of those qualities you mentioned, which is what you're good at, what you love, what you can get paid for, and what the world needs.
Yeah.
And it's a revelatory process to arrive at that place where all of those kind of boxes are ticked. And the intersection of those is like your dharma, your ikigai, your purpose, like a reason for being where you feel most activated by life. And I think it's important to hear and reflect on stories about the moments that led to that, because everyone sees the highlight reel and the glory and the big podcast and the successful New York Times bestselling book and like all these things, but they don't really get to see the trenches of the moments where you were crying because your ex left you, or you couldn't make rent and you were so stressed. And like those moments, so many series of those moments often are required to be on the path to one day feeling secure and like you have stability in your life and you are aligned and feel like you are living your purpose and whatnot. So yeah, I just think it's important and I'm glad you shared about a little bit of those moments where you really did not feel like you had it, locked in.
Yeah. And today, even today, given all that I've accomplished and all the good that I think I've put out into the world, I mean, you still get criticism, thanks to the nature of social media. I mean, anybody in any basement anywhere can, create a social media profile and go onto your feed and let you know how they really feel about you. And I think like once you have a sense of a noble aim, I think that's a term that Jordan Peterson coined. Your eye on the prize of something larger than yourself, where you've been able to remove your ego, then these little affronts to your ego day to day, which are bound to happen, right? Like you're bound to generate criticism by stepping out of line, by sticking your neck out. I mean, if you want to go uncriticized, like don't do anything, But if you're doing anything of note, you're gonna be criticized. And I think the way to maintain a healthy mind about it is to always, have that North Star, that noble aim, something bigger than yourself. It's the same reason why, missionaries will go down to a third world country and like, despite all the pushback and the violence and whatever, like they're on a mission for God, I'm not on a mission for God. I'm on a mission to help people get healthier. But that's why when people come over and they criticize me, they don't fully understand what it is that I'm about. They don't know my thesis. Then, it's like rain falling off of a windshield. It doesn't bother me, because I feel like I have that. But for anybody that feels like they're being criticized or what have you, I just think you have to remember that we live in a time where even the most benign thing that exists has critics. There are people out there that hate Disney World. There are people that hate pizza, So I think as long as you're being true to yourself and you've got that noble aim in sight, then I think it's all going to be okay. Like the critics don't bother me. And yeah, it's fine. It's just par for the course.
Yeah. What have you felt is the power of community and relationships? Like we are these tribal beings that are meant to relate, some say in, tribes of 150 or 200 people really. Mm-hmm. And we're on one end so connected to so many people, but also very disconnected to, and for most people, very disconnected to, real human relationships in this physical world where you're just there for each other. And I'm just curious about your perspective on the power of having a community and friend group that are aligned with your values, and how that contributes to well-being.
Yeah, I mean, community is super important. I love my friends, but I also think family is very important. I'm a big family guy. And I spend a lot of time with my family, my brothers, my dad. That's a big part of my life is my family. And then, your chosen family, your friends, I think are also crucially important. And unfortunately, not everybody has that. We live in a time where many of us subsist on parasocial relationships on, thanks to social media. But I think obviously having friends in your life plays an important role. Having a pet, I think, is really important from the standpoint of mental health. And so, yeah, it all kind of plays a role. What was that Harvard study of adult development? It's an 80-year running ongoing study at Harvard found that like the one variable that had the strongest correlation between healthy outcomes and lifespan was being socially connected well into one's golden years. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. Whenever I'm feeling down, whenever I'm feeling frustrated, I know that I always have somebody that I can reach out to, whether it be family or people that I work with or close friends. I mean, I think that that's a real gift. It's a real privilege today when so many seem to be so isolated. And yeah, I'm definitely a big advocate for it. And if you don't have access to community, I think I think there's a degree of faking it that one can do. I think like social media is great. If you live in a small town and you feel chronically isolated, I think social media can make you feel somewhat more connected. You just have to be really careful because social media can, there's a lot of downsides to social media from the standpoint of mental health. The chronic comparison, the, hyper filtered, hyper stylized version of reality that social media tends to present. I think that can obviously be to the detriment of mental health. But yeah, I mean, I have friends on social media that I've never met in person, but that are like friends, and we share memes, and I think that's like one of the, more benevolent aspects of social media today is that we can have these sort of parasocial relationships. They're not replacements for the real thing, but I think they can be helpful.
What's the leading edge of growth for you in your personal life right now? What are you, anything you're growing through that is like a new area or
Oh man. Well, I've been seeing somebody. I have like a girlfriend for the first time in more than a decade.
Let's go.
Yeah, let's go. So that's been great. That's been actually quite wonderful. And it's been a journey because it's just new territory for me, but she's very sweet, very smart, very funny. And she speaks in terms of her dharma as well, which I think is really funny.
Nice.
She's a very enlightened being. And yeah, so I'm just trying to keep up, but no, she's great. So that's been a really interesting, I guess, like new development.
Is that bringing up stuff? Inevitably, it has to, right?
Yeah. Of course, of course. But it's I felt like, I guess, like ready in my life to like lean into that, and of course I'm at it wasn't just my decision. Like she actually chose me in a way, and it's been just really great. So I don't know. I'm just trying to live in the present as much as I can, and I tend to overthink things, like jump ahead to the future, spend a little too much time in the past. But I've also seen a therapist for the better part of the past 2 years. I'm not currently, but I did for a while, and that was one of the big takeaways. Is I got to learn how to be more in the present. That's a good take home for anybody struggling with like anxiety, depression. I didn't have clinical anxiety or depression or anything like that, but I will say that learning how to be in the present because we tend to, our thoughts tend to run away from us, and I think it can be the cause of a lot of anguish, and I'm certainly definitely somebody who's experienced that. I'm either like anxious about what I think might happen in the future, or depressed about something that's dead and buried in the past. But the present really is all we have, and so if we can learn to be here now, I think it's a really important skill. To cultivate. So yeah, I guess those are kind of like some of the newer
Yeah.
ideas that I've been mulling over.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it, dude. Well, thanks. I mean, I really just appreciate your, I guess, energy and approach to discussing a lot of these topics because it is such a polarizing space where people even become evangelical about, what their beliefs are or their dogmas, and it becomes very affirming to people's confirmation bias. And yeah, I think it's important to like look at the stuff non-emotionally, kind of really discern. And yeah, I think it's just an incredible service that you're providing for people. And yeah, dude, you're a powerful educator. So thanks for doing what you're doing, living your dharma.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, you've added to my vocabulary.
Yes.
No, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That means a lot.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with today?
Oh man. Well, this was a ton of fun, and I super value you and everything that you're putting out into the world. And I guess for me, the story of my mom and everything that she went through is portrayed in a documentary that I am about to release, depending on when this comes out. But the film is called Little Empty Boxes, and it's going to be a very powerful watch for anybody that has any experience whatsoever with dementia, either as a patient or as a caregiver. If you've had a loved one suffer from the condition, the film is a really intimate look into what it's like, both from the patient side and the caregiver side. And if it's a tribute to my mom, it's a tribute to the science of dementia prevention. And I'm super excited for the film to come out. And we're going to be taking it on tour, releasing it at theaters across the country so people can learn more and get a ticket at littleemptyboxes.com. The film's called Little Empty Boxes, so littleemptyboxes.com. And yeah, I look forward to connecting with people on the gram, on my podcast, on all the places.
Brad, so good. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, thanks, brother. We'll have to do, we're going to definitely do a premiere in LA, and so you'll definitely be invited to that. Don't worry about that.
Rad. Congrats, man. I know that's been a long time coming.
Yeah, man, 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, a long time.
All right, everybody, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Know Thyself podcast. I appreciate you for coming on this journey and just doing the best you can with the knowledge that you have at the level that you're at, and trying to implement and become the best version of yourself so that, you can live a purpose-driven life and follow your dharma and have those healthy relationships and thrive in community and all these things that we're talking to. Thanks for coming and joining us in this conversation. Until next time, be well.